Next up is Kelly Barnhill. Did she make it?
I did. Oh, well, you know. Kelly the Beast Barnhill. I'm fresh out of urgent care, so if I pass out, don't be surprised. This is my novel that is coming out in the fall. I just saw the preliminary sketches for the cover art, and it's really cool. I'm excited. And it's called The Witch's Boy. I already know I'm going to get slammed for this book because it's too sad for middle grade. I wrote a book about grief and also about giant stone monsters who can crush a man to bits. So that's it. Chapter 1, The Twins. Once upon a time, there were two brothers, as alike to one another as you are to your own reflection. They had the same eyes, the same hands, the same voice, the same insatiable curiosity. And though it was generally agreed that one was slightly quicker, slightly cleverer, slightly more wonderful than the other, no one could tell the boys apart. And even when they thought they could, they were usually wrong. Which is the one who has the scar on his nose? People would ask. And which is the one with the saucy grin? Is Ned the smart one, or is it Tam? Ned, some said. Tam, said the others. They couldn't decide, but surely one was better. It stood to reason. And for God's sakes, boys, their exasperated neighbors would sigh, would you stand still so that we may look at you properly? The boys would not stand still. They were a whirlwind of shrieks and schemes and wicked grins. They would not be pinned down. And so the question as to which one was the quick one, the clever one, the more wonderful one, remained a subject of some debate. One day, the boys decided that it was high time that they built a raft. Working in secret and with great attention to detail, they constructed their raft using scraps of lumber and bits of rope and cast off pieces of broken furniture and sticks, careful to hide their work from their mother. Once they felt the vessel was seaworthy, they slid it into the great river and climbed aboard, hoping to make it to the sea. They were mistaken. The vessel was not seaworthy. Very quickly, the rushing currents pulled the raft apart, and the boys were thrown into the water, fighting for their lives. Their father, a broad, strong man, dove into the water, and though he could barely swim, struggled through the current towards his children. A crowd gathered at the edge of the water. They were afraid of the river, afraid of the spirits that lived in the water who might snatch a man if he wasn't careful, pull him toward the dark muck at the bottom. They did not dive in to assist the man or his drowning children. Instead, they called out helpful comments to the terrified father. "Mind you keep their heads above the water when you drag them back," one woman yelled. "And if you can only save one," a man added, "make sure you save the right one." The current separated the boys. The father couldn't save them both. He kicked and swore, but as he reached one boy, the closer boy, his twin, had been swept far down the length of the river and out of sight. His body washed ashore later that day, swollen and aghast. The people gathered around the small dead child and shook their heads. "We should have known he'd bungle it," they said. "He saved the wrong one." The wrong boy lived. Chapter 2, A Sharp Needle and a Bit of Thread. The wrong boy was barely alive. He had swallowed so much of the murky river that his small belly swelled. His lungs sagged under the weight of water. They slurped and wheezed and wouldn't hold air. His father gently laid the boy on the ground and tipped back his chin. He pressed his lips to the boy's lips and blew his own breath into the boy's mouth again and again. Again, "Don't be scared," his father whispered, "don't be scared." But if he was talking to the boy or to himself, no one could tell. The boy didn't breathe. "Come on, Neddy," the father said, "my little Ned. Come now and wake for Papa. Open your eyes." But the boy didn't open his eyes. Finally, after several breaths forced into his mouth, Ned gasped. He coughed and coughed again as the river cascaded in great gushes from his mouth. He breathed, though not very well. His lips were blue, and his skin was as pale as bone. His father removed his coat and wrapped it around his son. Ned coughed violently, his small body rattling from his eyebrows to his toes. "The sea, Tam!" he sighed. The sea!" He shuddered. His teeth clattered and clacked. His father gathered him into his arms and carried him home. By the time they arrived, Ned was insensible with fever, and his father couldn't wake him. Back at the river, a handful of men and women from the village walked quietly down the long, lonely shore to retrieve the body of the drowned twin. The boy's mother waited, seated on a rock, straight-backed, her fingers shirring the fabric of her dress, gathering fistfuls of skirt and letting it slip through her open hands over and over again. Her eyes gazed at nothing. She had a name, but no one used it. Her children called her mother, her husband called her wife, and everyone else called her Sister Witch. She was a woman of power, both loved and resented, who was listened to always. "All that magic," the people muttered among themselves as they cradled the dead boy in their arms and carried him back, "and for nothing. She cannot even save her own children. What on earth is the point?" Sister Witch was a keeper of a small store of magic, one so ancient and powerful that everyone knew it could kill a man if he touched it, but it did her no good. Her magic could only be used in the service of others. This is what people believed, and Sister Witch allowed it. They were only wrong by one word: should. It only should be used for others. It's a dangerous thing, her magic, with consequences. "Stupid," people said, "a waste." But some, who had remembered the help they had received from the magic worker, their sicknesses erased, their crops rescued, their lost children miraculously found, who were still grateful, pressed their hands to their mouths to stop their grief. "Poor Sister Witch," they said, "the poor, poor thing." And their hearts broke, just a little. The boy's mother heard the muttering, but didn't respond. People would think what they think, and they would likely think wrong. This was nothing new. Finally, as the light of day began to slant and thin, the dead child was brought to his mother. She sank to her knees. "Sister Witch," an older woman said. Her name was Madame Thwain, and she was the youngest member of the Council of Elders. And though she was normally imperious and stuffy, not to mention suspicious of the witch, the presence of the dead child seemed to break her. Her eyes glowed and her voice cracked. "Let me bring you a cloth to wrap him in, and we shall lay him out as tender as can be." "No, thank you," Sister Witch said. No one could help her, not this time. She ignored the eyes of her neighbors on her back as she laid her boy's head on her shoulder and wound her arms around his body and carried him home for the last time. The house, when she arrived back, was quiet and sad. Her husband lay on the floor next to the bed, fast asleep, utterly exhausted by worry and grief. Ned, her living child, struggled for breath. His lungs were dank and muddy. The great river boiled inside him, its fever claiming the victim who should have drowned. There was little chance the boy would survive the night, not without help. "Oh no," Sister Witch whispered. "That will not do at all. My little Ned will live." She went to her sewing basket and retrieved a spool of strong black thread. She pulled out her sharpest needle and, running the tip along the edge of a whetstone again and again, made it so sharp that the merest touch on her finger produced a tiny bloom of red blood. She paused and brought the wounded finger to her lips and sucked the blood away. She closed her eyes and looked for a moment as though she was coming to a decision. Should not could not. The house's beams creaked and the rafters rattled and a foul smoke leaked through the floorboards. The house stank of magic, sulfur, then ash, then a blistered sweetness. The magic, she knew, was awake, listening, and hungry. It wanted out. "You stay where you are," Sister Witch chided. "I won't be needing you." The magic, an ancient foul-tempered thing, said nothing at first. It was trapped inside of its clay pot, secured in Sister Witch's workshop, a dry, sandy room dug under the house, accessible only by the trapdoor hiding under the rug. It rocked on its shelf, knocking its pot against the wall. "You can't do it without us." Magic didn't say this out loud, but Sister Witch could feel it all the same. "Come now, you bossy old meanie, let us out. We want to help." "I mean it," she said, though her voice had much less conviction than before. "I'll be fine on my own, and you'll just muck it up." The magic muttered a rude word, but Sister Witch ignored it. Fuming and fussing, its pot rattled its pot against the shelf and then was silent. A tight, dry, listening sort of silence, as though it was holding its breath. "There's a dear," Sister Witch said, out loud, as though praising a petulant child. Then she set to work. She rummaged in her linen's chest until she found a bit of white cloth, not as clean as she hoped, but clean enough. "It's not clean enough," the magic said. "I'm not listening to you," Sister Witch said as she attempted to scratch the spots off with her thumbnail. "Come now," the magic urged. "Death is not for the powerful, and it certainly isn't for the clever. The boy need not die. Do you even know where the dead go? Neither do we, and we don't intend to. Let us help, witchy dearest, please." She would not let the magic help. This is what she told herself as she kicked the rug away from the trap door. She would not use her magic for personal gain. This is what she told herself as she crept down the ladder and faced the clay pot on the shelf. "This isn't magic," she said as she set the skein of thread on top of the pot. The clay pot shuddered and smoked. The thread glowed orange, then yellow, then blue, then white. It shimmered. "Ah!" the magic sighed. "Ah! I knew!" "Silence!" she ordered, and the magic obeyed. She wrapped the thread in the cloth and scurried up the ladder as though burned. The thread was terribly heavy. It hurt her hands to hold it. "It isn't magic," she said out loud, as though she could will it true. And it wasn't magic after all, not really. The thread never actually touched the power inside the clay pot, it was only near it. There's a big difference between almost and actually, just like there's a difference between should and... She shook the thought away. Tam's body lay on the kitchen table, cold, swollen, and horribly still. Sister Witch sat next to him, running her hand along his cheeks and brow, letting her fingers twist in those dark, damp curls, and she waited for the sun to set. When someone dies, their soul stays trapped in the body until nightfall, and then it emerges and goes elsewhere. No one knew where. Sister Witch had seen this many times, but she had never interfered until now. The sun hovered over the edge of the sky, lurid and fat as an overripe peach, before slumping towards night. The light oozed overhead in garish colors. It was a sky that announced itself. Ned coughed and sighed. "Tam," he whispered as though through his dreaming. "Soon," his mother said to her living son across the room. She leaned in and kissed each eyelid of the dead twin. "Very soon." The sun widened, rippled, and disappeared under the lip of the land. Tam's body shuddered slightly, and she watched as his soul uncurled from his mouth, just as she knew it would, and oh, it was beautiful. The soul sprouted slowly, unfolded petal by petal, before opening like a flower and hovering before her. Sister Witch felt her breath catch. "My child," she thought, "my little child." She threw the white cloth over the soul and swaddled it like an infant. She clutched it to her chest, crooning all the while. The soul fluttered and wiggled in its wrapping. It shuddered and squirmed under the white cloth, desperate to get away. "I know, darling," she whispered to the soul. "I know, my sweet, sweet boy. I'm sorry, but I won't lose you both, not at once. Indeed, I cannot bear it." She kept her voice even and light, but her heart was breaking in her body. It shattered to pieces, and it would never heal. She brought the soul to her lips, kissing it gently. "Stay with your brother," she said, as she pressed the soul to the dying boy's chest. "Keep him alive," as she readied the needle. "Keep him safe," she said, as she untangled the thread, slicing off a section with her teeth. And as she pierced both soul and boy, as she stitched the two together, she said this: "Mother loves you. Don't forget it." And in that darkness and in that grieving house, the soul opened its throat and screamed. And the scream became a sigh, and the sigh became a cough, and Ned began to heal, and he lived.
Fantastic. That was Kelly Barnhill, by the way. There are accoutrements up here for the readers. There is a stand here for putting notes upon, and there's a seat to sit upon, and there's ketchup. And if you need any of these things as part of your reading.